Did you know that one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history, Ramses II, often called Ramses the Great, is remembered not only for his glorious temples, colossal statues, and legendary military victories, but also for a dark and disturbing family secret? Behind the shining legacy of this mighty ruler lies a tale that still shocks historians and archaeologists: the claim that Ramses II married one of his own daughters. This revelation may sound like a twisted rumor from the corridors of history, yet the evidence, scattered across inscriptions, royal family records, and ancient traditions, suggests that incest was not only practiced but at times celebrated among Egypt's most elite dynasties. To modern ears, the thought is horrifying. How could a father take his daughter as a wife? But in the sacred world of the pharaohs, the rules of morality were often overshadowed by the hunger for power, divine legitimacy, and the preservation of royal bloodlines. When we look at Ramses II, we see a man who reigned for an astonishing 66 years, becoming one of the longest-ruling monarchs in history. His name is carved on monuments from the Nile Delta to Nubia. He was a conqueror, a builder, a diplomat, and a godlike figure in the eyes of his people. Yet, as we peel away the golden mask of history, we discover that his family life was tangled in webs of politics, religion, and taboo relationships that today would spark outrage. Ancient Egypt believed that the pharaoh was not just a king, but a living god, the embodiment of Horus on earth. And what better way, they thought, to keep divine blood pure than to marry within the family? To them, it was a way of imitating the gods themselves, who, according to mythology, often married brothers to sisters, fathers to daughters, and mothers to sons. To us, it is unthinkable, but to Ramses, it was tradition, power, and perhaps even necessity. The whispers about Ramses II and his daughters emerge from the inscriptions that survive on temple walls and funerary texts. He fathered over 100 children, making him one of the most fertile rulers in history. Among his many wives and concubines, his daughters often appear not only as princesses but as queens, depicted standing beside him with titles usually reserved for wives. Scholars have long debated whether these daughters were elevated simply to symbolic roles, or whether they truly shared their father's bed as royal consorts. The strongest suggestion comes from Princess Binteneth, Ramses II's firstborn daughter, who carried the title of Great Royal Wife, a title that traditionally belonged to the pharaoh's chief spouse. This was not a ceremonial honor given lightly. It was the highest rank a woman could achieve in the royal court. Why would a daughter hold this title unless she had become more than just a child of the king? For ancient Egyptians, the union of a father and daughter might have been shocking to outsiders, but within their worldview, it was almost divine. The pharaoh was seen as a god whose bloodline had to remain untainted by outsiders. By marrying his daughter, Ramses II was not only preserving this sacred blood, but also reinforcing his image as the earthly counterpart of the gods. In their mythology, gods like Osiris married their sisters, Isis and Nephthys. The royal family imitated these unions, believing that such marriages granted them divine approval. But while mythology offered justification, reality tells a darker tale. These marriages trapped daughters in roles they could never escape, reducing them from independent women to pawns in a political and religious chess game. Imagine for a moment the life of Princess Binteneth, born into unimaginable luxury. She grew up in palaces lined with gold, educated in reading hieroglyphs, and surrounded by servants who bowed at her feet. Yet, as the daughter of Ramses the Great, her destiny was not her own. The day she became her father's great royal wife, she stepped into a world where personal choice meant nothing, where her role was to secure her father's divine image and strengthen his rule. To us, this feels like betrayal of the highest order. What father would do this? But to Ramses, it was the natural order of kingship, a necessary step to ensure the stability of his dynasty. This disturbing truth opens a window into a larger question: how much of Egyptian history is hidden behind the glittering monuments we admire today? Tourists who stand in awe before the temples of Abu Simbel or Luxor see the majesty of Ramses II, the warrior king and builder. They rarely stop to think about the dark family dynamics that lay behind those stones. Yet, history refuses to let these secrets rest forever. Archaeological evidence, royal inscriptions, and ancient gossip preserved by scribes reveal a world that was far more complex and far more unsettling than we imagine. And so the story of Ramses II marrying his daughter is not merely a scandal. It is a lens through which we can see the clash between divine ideology and human morality, between power and love, between myth and reality. By the end of his reign, Ramses II was worshipped as a god, his image carved on colossal statues that still tower above us. But his legacy carries a disturbing truth that even the greatest king of Egypt could not escape the temptations, pressures, and corruptions of absolute power. Did Ramses truly love his daughter, or was she just another sacrifice at the altar of power? Was she honored as a queen, or trapped in a gilded cage of incest and politics? These are questions we may never fully answer, but the fragments of history leave little doubt. Behind the grandeur of Ramses the Great was a man willing to cross the most forbidden line to preserve his dynasty. And that chilling fact changes how we see not only Ramses but the very civilization that crowned him as their god. When we peel back the layers of Ramses II's family life, the disturbing reality becomes even clearer. His obsession with power was inseparable from his obsession with controlling his bloodline. To understand why a ruler as celebrated as Ramses the Great would marry his own daughter, we must step into the mindset of ancient Egypt itself. Unlike the moral codes of today, the Egyptian worldview revolved around the concept of Matha, divine order of the universe. Pharaohs were believed to be the guardians of this cosmic balance, chosen by the gods to rule not merely as kings, but as divine beings in human flesh. For them, the purity of the royal bloodline was not just about inheritance, it was about ensuring the gods' favor. By marrying within the family, the pharaoh reinforced his godlike status, claiming that only those born of his blood were worthy to share his throne. This ideology created a cycle where incest was not only accepted but ritualized as a sacred duty. Ramses II did not invent this tradition, he inherited it. Long before his time, Egypt's rulers had engaged in sibling marriages to keep power concentrated within the royal family. The Ptolemies, centuries later, would perfect this practice, with queens like Cleopatra VII marrying their brothers to preserve dynastic control. But Ramses took this concept one step further. His reign was one of stability and expansion. He was not simply fighting for survival, he was building an empire of glory. And in that pursuit, he did something chilling. He turned his daughters into his queens. His eldest daughter Bintaneth became the great royal wife, but she was not the only one. Other daughters, such as Meritamun, also carried queenly titles. The implication is unmistakable. Ramses blurred the lines between fatherhood and kingship, between protector and possessor. The symbolism of these marriages was powerful. When Ramses stood beside his daughter queens in temples, carved forever in stone, the message was clear. His dynasty was eternal, divine, and unbroken by outsiders. These marriages acted as a shield against the infiltration of non-royal blood into the throne. Yet beneath this symbolism lay the harsh human cost. The daughters had no freedom, no choice in their fates. Their lives became performances in the theater of power, where their father's image mattered more than their own happiness. Imagine the fear and silence that must have hung in the palace corridors. Who could question the God King's will? Who could protect the daughters from being swallowed whole by the machinery of divine kingship? The priests, courtiers, and scribes all knew their survival depended on loyalty, not truth, and so the cycle of silence endured. It is worth noting that in Egyptian art, queens were depicted almost identically, regardless of whether they were daughters, sisters, or wives. They appear on temple walls, standing beside the pharaoh, adorned with crowns and sacred symbols, embodying beauty and authority. This imagery hides the disturbing truth. Behind the polished surface, many of these queens were blood relatives of the king. For Ramses, this was not a scandal to be hidden. It was a declaration of supremacy. By placing his daughters in these positions, he proclaimed to the world that his blood was so sacred, so divine, that no outsider was worthy of standing beside him. The temples that today inspire awe were also monuments to this disturbing ideology. But the story does not end there. Ramses' incestuous unions had consequences that rippled through his dynasty. Genetic studies of mummies from Egypt's royal families reveal that inbreeding led to deformities, weakened immune systems, and premature deaths. The later rulers of Egypt's dynasties suffered from conditions like cleft palates, bone deformities, and weakened physical traced back to generations of incestuous unions. While Ramses himself lived an extraordinarily long life well into his 90s, his legacy of marrying his daughters planted seeds of weakness in the dynasty he sought to preserve. His short-term gain of divine legitimacy became a long-term curse on his bloodline. What makes this story even more disturbing is that Ramses was not alone in this practice. Across the ancient world, incest among royalty was not uncommon. The Inca emperors of Peru, centuries later, married sisters to keep their divine bloodline pure. The rulers of Hawaii did the same. Even in medieval Europe, cousin marriages among royals created centuries of genetic decline, culminating in tragic figures like the Habsburg kings of Spain, whose jaw deformities became infamous. Yet Ramses' marriage to his daughters strikes a particularly haunting note, because of the sheer scale of his family and the grandeur of his reign. Here was a man celebrated as one of history's greatest kings, yet behind the statues and temples was a father who violated the most sacred trust imaginable. And so we are left with a haunting paradox. Ramses II is remembered both as a god among men and as a man who defied natural boundaries in the pursuit of power. He was the builder of Abu Simbel, the victor of the Battle of Kadesh, the architect of temples that still defy time. But he was also the father who turned his daughters into wives, erasing the line between parent and partner. This duality forces us to ask difficult questions about history itself. Do we admire the greatness of a ruler without confronting the shadows he cast? Or do we dare to look beyond the monuments and see the humanity flawed, disturbing, and dark that lies beneath? The disturbing truth of Ramses II is not just a story about incest. It is a story about power, corruption, and the lengths to which rulers will go to preserve their legacies. His actions remind us that history is not made by saints, but by men who often carry within them both brilliance and darkness. And in Ramses' case, the darkness is one that still chills us thousands of years later. If we try to step into Ramses II's mind, we must understand the duality of his world. On one hand, he was a father, a man with flesh and blood, capable of affection, pride, and care for his children. On the other hand, he was Pharaoh, the living god of Egypt, a role that demanded he transcend ordinary morality. For Ramses, being Pharaoh meant more than ruling a nation. It meant embodying the gods themselves. And if the gods could break human boundaries, then so could he. In this way, the marriage to his daughter was not just a personal act, but a performance of divinity, staged for the eyes of his people. Every inscription, every temple, relief, every ceremonial ritual reinforced the message. Ramses was not a mere mortal, and neither were his family. They were gods walking among men. But the tragedy here is clear: the human lives caught within this divine drama had no choice, no freedom, and no escape. Binteneth, Ramses' eldest daughter, is the central figure in this story. She was not only given the title of great royal wife, but was depicted in temples and inscriptions standing beside her father, sometimes even wearing the regalia of a queen. To the casual observer, this might look like a symbol of honor, a celebration of her elevated status. But to modern eyes, it reveals something far more sinister. The role of great royal wife was not ceremonial, it was intimate, powerful, and deeply tied to the throne. It meant that Binteneth was not only her father's daughter, but also his partner in the divine rituals that defined kingship. Her image carved in stone was more than decoration. It was proof that Ramses had chosen her not just as his child, but as his queen. Imagine the burden this placed on her shoulders. Born into privilege, yes, but forced into a role where her very identity was consumed by her father's need for power. Historians and archaeologists continue to debate how far these relationships went. Some argue that titles like Great Royal Wife may not always have implied a sexual relationship, but others point to the consistency of Egyptian traditions, where wives were often depicted in positions of intimacy with the pharaoh, and conclude that the evidence is too strong to ignore. The sheer number of Ramses' children further complicates this picture. With more than 100 offspring, he had concubines, secondary wives, and queens, creating a vast family tree that blurred the lines between daughter, sister, and consort. It is entirely possible that his daughter wives also bore him children, intertwining the bloodlines even more. If so, then the genetic consequences of these unions would have been profound, contributing to the weakening of the dynasty in the generations that followed. But why did no one stop him? Why was there no outrage, no rebellion, no condemnation recorded in the annals of history? The answer lies in the iron grip of ideology. The Egyptians revered their pharaoh as a god. To question his actions was to question the divine order itself, a crime punishable not just in this life but in the afterlife. Priests, nobles, and commoners alike accepted that the king's will was the god's will. Even if whispers of unease passed through the palace halls, they were drowned out by the thunderous voice of tradition and fear. In the temples, Bintaneth was not portrayed as a victim but as a radiant queen, her beauty and grace immortalized in stone. For the people, this was not incest, it was divinity in action. But for Bintaneth, and perhaps for other daughters like Meritamun, it was a gilded prison from which there was no release. This dynamic where power cloaks corruption in sacred authority repeats itself across history. The Roman Emperor Caligula famously slept with his sisters and flaunted his incestuous relationships as proof of his godlike status. The Inca emperors of Peru married their sisters for the same reason. Even in medieval Europe, royal blood was so carefully guarded that cousin marriages became the norm, leading to generations of weakened heirs. But Ramses II's case stands out because of his grandeur. He was not a minor king in a forgotten corner of the world. He was Ramses the Great, one of the most celebrated rulers in history. His temples still stand, his statues still gaze across the desert, his name is etched into the memory of civilization. And yet, behind this grandeur lies the uncomfortable truth that he crossed the most sacred boundary of family. The psychological aspect is equally fascinating. For Ramses, perhaps these unions were not seen as violations at all, but as acts of divine necessity, surrounded from birth by priests, rituals, and myths that glorified incest among the gods. He might have seen himself as simply fulfilling a higher duty. But what of his daughters? Did they believe in this divine narrative, convincing themselves that their suffering was holy? Or did they silently endure, their hearts breaking beneath the weight of their roles? History does not preserve their voices, only their images. We can only imagine their thoughts, their fears, and their silent prayers to gods who never answered. The irony is painful. Ramses II sought to preserve his dynasty by keeping the bloodline pure, yet in doing so, he planted the seeds of fragility. Generations of inbreeding weakened the royal house, leading eventually to decline. The very act that was meant to secure eternity brought vulnerability instead. This is the cruel paradox of history. Those who seek absolute power often destroy the very thing they wish to protect. Ramses' monuments may have endured, but his dynasty, like so many others, fell victim to the hidden rot of incest and corruption. And so, when we stand today before the colossal statues of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, we must see not only the God-King in all his majesty, but also the man behind the mask. A man who, in his hunger for power, forced his own daughter into the role of wife. A man whose greatness is inseparable from his darkness. This is the disturbing truth of Ramses the Great, that the same hands which carved temples of glory also rewrote the laws of morality, sacrificing family on the altar of power. To truly grasp the disturbing marriage between Ramses II and his daughter, we must look beyond the walls of his palace and into the soul of ancient Egyptian culture. In the eyes of his people, the pharaoh was not a mortal king but a god made flesh, the son of Ra, the living Horus, and the heir of Osiris. Every action he took, no matter how shocking to us today, was cloaked in divine legitimacy. Egyptian mythology itself was filled with stories of incestuous unions among the gods. Osiris married his sister Isis, and together they conceived Horus, the falcon-headed god who became the eternal symbol of kingship. Even Seth, the god of chaos, was intertwined with his sisters in disturbing unions. To the Egyptians, these stories were not taboos, they were sacred precedents, divine models to be imitated by those who ruled in the god's name. And so, when Ramses II made his daughter Bintaneth his queen, it was not presented as corruption but as continuity with the divine order. But here is where the tragedy lies. Myths that were meant to inspire became chains that bound the royal family into cycles of suffering. For Bintaneth, being crowned great royal wife was not a choice, but a destiny carved in stone long before her birth. To resist would be to defy her father, the living God, and by extension, to defy the gods themselves. In a world where religion was life itself, such defiance was unthinkable. And so she stepped into her role, perhaps with dignity, perhaps with fear, but certainly with no way of escape. Her life was consumed by the rituals of queenship offering to the gods, standing beside her father in ceremonies, bearing titles that proclaimed her as consort rather than daughter. Every day was a performance of divinity, but behind the performance was the silenced cry of a daughter bound by duty. The temples built under Ramses' reign reflect this ideology. At Abu Simbel, Luxor, and the Ramesseum, images of the king and his queens are carved in colossal scale. The queens are depicted smaller than Ramses, a symbol of their subservience, but their presence beside him emphasizes legitimacy. Among these queens, Bintaneth and other daughters appear, their images immortalized in sacred stone. For tourists today, these carvings inspire awe, but when read closely, they whisper the truth. These daughters were not just children, they were partners in a divine drama that blurred the lines of family and morality. Ramses knew that stone endures longer than memory, and by carving these relationships into temples, he sanctified them for eternity. Religion served as both justification and weapon. Priests, who might otherwise have questioned such unions, were themselves beneficiaries of Ramses' power. The pharaoh funded temples, endowed priesthoods, and ensured that the gods were worshipped with splendor. In return, the priests upheld his divine image, blessing even his most controversial choices. This symbiotic relationship created an unbreakable wall of silence. The people saw what the priests proclaimed. Ramses was the god-king, his daughters his queens, and their union a reflection of the heavens. Who among them would dare suggest otherwise? To do so would not only defy Ramses, but risk eternal punishment in the afterlife. Fear and faith became tools of control, ensuring that the truth remained buried beneath layers of ritual and myth. Yet even within this culture, not all Egyptians may have accepted these unions without unease. Common people lived by their own moral codes, shaped by family, community, and survival. For them, incest was not a way of life, but a horror to be avoided. The pharaoh lived in a world apart, his actions untouchable, his will unquestionable. They might have whispered in secret, traded stories in the shadows, but never could they voice dissent publicly. The weight of divine authority was too great. And so the cycle continued, with silence protecting power and power demanding silence. What makes Ramses II's story even more haunting is that he had choices. Unlike rulers of weaker kingdoms, constantly threatened by enemies and instability, Ramses presided over a golden age of Egyptian power. He did not need to marry his daughters to secure his throne. His rule was already unshakable. His armies victorious, his monuments unrivaled. And yet he chose to follow the path of divine incest, not out of desperation but out of a desire to elevate his image to godlike heights. For him, this was not survival, it was supremacy. It was the declaration that he was not merely king of Egypt but Egypt itself, a man whose blood was too sacred to mix with outsiders. His daughter's body became the canvas on which he painted this declaration, her life consumed to magnify his immortality. The echoes of this choice reverberate through history. Later, pharaohs would look back on Ramses the Great not only as a model of military and architectural achievement but also as a precedent for royal incest. His actions, immortalized in temples and inscriptions, became part of the tradition that future rulers would imitate. In this way, Ramses' dark choice extended far beyond his lifetime, shaping the destinies of generations yet unborn. And with each generation, the bloodline weakened, the gods' supposed favor eroded by the very unions meant to preserve it. Here lies the ultimate irony. Ramses sought to become immortal, to carve his name into eternity, to stand forever as the god-king of Egypt. And in many ways, he succeeded. More than 3,000 years later, his statues still tower over deserts. His name still commands awe. His mummy still rests in Cairo as a relic of glory. But alongside this legacy of greatness lies the shadow. He could not erase the truth that he turned his daughter into his wife, that he crossed the line no father should cross, that in his hunger for divinity, he sacrificed humanity. And this shadow, too, endures, staining his glory with the blood of silence. Did you know that Ramses II's reign, despite its grandeur and glory, hides some of the darkest and most morally shocking secrets in ancient Egyptian history? We often see him as the ultimate warrior pharaoh, a king who built colossal temples, fought legendary battles, and ruled with unmatched authority. But beneath the glittering stone monuments and golden statues lies a story that Egyptologists struggle to fully explain: the strange, disturbing, and deeply controversial marriages between Ramses and his own daughters. For some, this revelation feels like stepping into the shadowy chambers of a royal palace, where what the public saw was splendor, but what happened behind closed doors was something far more unsettling. When we study Ramses II, we see an image of power carved into history. He reigned for over 60 years, longer than nearly any other pharaoh. and he left behind monuments so vast they can still be seen today. But what many don't realize is that his life was not just about politics and conquest. It was also about bloodlines, succession, and the eternal obsession with divine kingship. The Egyptians didn't simply see their kings as men, they saw them as living gods on earth. And if the pharaoh was a god, then perhaps his bloodline had to remain pure, untouched by outsiders, even if that meant marrying within his own family. But how did such an idea become acceptable? And why did Ramses, of all rulers, embrace it? To understand, we have to remember that Ramses II fathered an extraordinary number of children. Historians estimate he may have had over 100 sons and daughters, born from his many wives and concubines. His chief queen Nefertari was beloved and immortalized on temple walls. But when she died, a strange pattern began to appear. Ramses began elevating some of his own daughters into the position of great royal wife, the highest rank a woman in Egypt could hold. These daughters weren't just ceremonial figures, they took on real roles in palace life, appearing in temple inscriptions and official records as queens in their own right. And it is here that the disturbing truth comes to light. Ramses wasn't just giving them symbolic titles, he was taking them as his wives. One of the most famous examples is his daughter Bintaneth. She was born early in his reign, making her both his child and, later, his queen. Her name appears beside Ramses on temple reliefs, clearly showing her elevated to the role of great royal wife. For historians, this is not simply a ceremonial placement. This was a deliberate move by Ramses to keep the royal bloodline consolidated within the family. Another daughter, Meritamen, also rose to this same position. Together, these daughters were not hidden or shamed, they were displayed proudly on monuments that still stand today. To the Egyptians, this was not viewed with the same moral lens we apply in the modern world. Instead, it was a continuation of divine kingship, a reinforcement that the blood of Ra, the sun god, flowed through Ramses and must not be diluted. But behind this religious and political justification lies an uncomfortable reality. What must it have been like for these daughters, who were born into a palace of gold, only to later be told that their father would also be their husband? Could they refuse? Most likely not. To be a daughter of Ramses meant to live under his shadow, to carry not only his blood, but also his political ambitions. In this sense, marriage was less about love and more about survival, about cementing Ramses' control over his dynasty. The daughters became symbols of loyalty, extensions of his godlike rule, and tools in a broader game of power. Still, for modern readers, the thought of a father-daughter marriage remains disturbing and unsettling. Archaeologists and historians debate just how far these marriages went. Were they purely symbolic, designed to elevate the daughter's status, or were they truly consummated unions? Evidence points to the latter being more likely. Ancient Egyptian culture, unlike many others, did not consider royal incest taboo. In fact, the precedent had been set centuries earlier by the likes of Akhenaten, who married his daughter, and even further back by earlier dynasties that practiced sibling marriages to maintain divine purity. Ramses was simply continuing a tradition, but on a larger, more public scale than most. The disturbing truth about Ramses II's marriages is not only about the personal lives of the pharaoh and his children, also about what it says regarding Egyptian society as a whole. This was a civilization that placed kingship above morality, power above personal relationships, and divine authority above human bonds. To them, the pharaoh was not a father in the human sense. He was a god whose children, even daughters, could be transformed into queens to maintain cosmic order. What shocks us today may have seemed completely natural to an Egyptian living 3,000 years ago. Yet, even as we try to explain it through the lens of history, we cannot ignore the unsettling undertone of it all. The image of Ramses, an old king in his later years, still taking his daughters as wives, paints a picture that is both powerful and haunting. He was a man who conquered empires, built cities, and stood taller than any of his rivals. But he was also a man who blurred the lines between family and power, between love and authority, in ways that remain controversial even now. The legacy of these marriages did not die with Ramses. His children, grandchildren, and future dynasties would inherit this strange blending of family and politics. It shows us that history is never clean or simple. Even the greatest rulers carried secrets that challenge our understanding of morality. Ramses II may be remembered as the greatest pharaoh of Egypt, But part of his story, perhaps the most shocking part, will always be the disturbing truth that he married his own daughters. Did you know that Ramses II lived long enough to outlast most of his wives, sons, and even many of his daughters? His reign stretched over 6 decades, so long, in fact, that entire generations rose and fell while he still sat upon the throne. This unusual longevity created a situation no other Egyptian pharaoh had ever faced. How could he keep the royal household stable, the throne secure, and the perception of divine kingship unshaken, when so many of his heirs died before him? For Ramses, the answer was both practical and controversial. He married his daughters, elevating them to queenship when other candidates were gone. It was not only an act of family entanglement, it was a desperate strategy to preserve his dynasty's sacred aura. One must imagine what the Egyptian court looked like during these later decades of Ramses' reign. The palace would have been filled with dozens upon dozens of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all waiting to see who would inherit the throne of Egypt. Jealousies, rivalries, and palace intrigues were inevitable in such a massive family. Ramses, who had fathered over 100 children, had to manage not just a kingdom but a family empire within the palace walls. In such circumstances, marrying his daughters was a way of keeping the center of power close to him. By making them queens, Ramses did not just elevate them, he ensured their loyalty, securing their influence so that they would not be used as pawns by ambitious princes or rival factions. One striking example is his daughter Bintaneth, who served as great royal wife during his later years. Her name appears alongside Ramses in temple inscriptions, which show her standing in the role usually reserved for a king's most powerful consort. Another daughter, Meritamen, also rose to the same rank. For these women, their lives were not their own. They were bound by the heavy weight of dynastic duty. While the titles gave them prestige and honor, they also came with the disturbing reality that they were both daughters and wives of the same man. To us, this sounds like a nightmare, but in the Egyptian worldview, it was a divine arrangement. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was not simply a ruler, he was a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, and later, the son of Ra. To them, the union between a godlike father and his daughter was not incest, but a continuation of divine bloodlines. After all, their mythology was filled with similar stories. The gods themselves often married their siblings or children to preserve cosmic order. In this sense, Ramses' actions were framed as religious necessity, not moral corruption. Still, it's important to remember that even in ancient Egypt, not everyone may have seen it this way. Priests, courtiers, and common people might have whispered about the strange decisions of their pharaoh, though they would never dare to speak openly against the living god. Another layer of this disturbing truth lies in Ramses' obsession with legacy. He wanted to be remembered not just as a great ruler, but as the eternal pharaoh, a king whose name would live forever. He built more statues of himself than any other king, carved his image into temples across Egypt, and inscribed his victories into stone. By marrying his daughters, Ramses ensured that his queens would always remain within the family circle, reinforcing the message that he and his bloodline were eternal. Outsiders, whether foreign princesses or rival Egyptian nobles, would have no claim to his throne. It was a closed circle, designed to protect his dynasty at any cost. Yet this strategy came with consequences. Many of Ramses' sons died before him, leaving the throne to his 13th son Merneptah, who finally succeeded him when Ramses was over 90 years old. By that time, Ramses had ruled for so long that Egypt had almost forgotten what it meant to have a new king. His daughters, who had been his wives and queens, had lived lives of glory, but also of strange contradictions. They were worshipped as queens and mothers of Egypt, yet at the same time, they carried the heavy truth of being wives to their own father. Their lives are carved into stone, immortalized in temples like Abu Simbel, where their images still stand as silent witnesses to a history we find difficult to comprehend. It is also important to consider how historians discovered these secrets. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions rarely confessed uncomfortable truths. The temples and tombs present idealized images, not confessions of personal scandal. Yet when archaeologists began piecing together names, titles, and family lineages, the shocking reality became clear. The daughters listed as great royal wives were unmistakably Ramses' own children. The evidence is undeniable. Stone carvings, papyrus documents, and burial artifacts all point to the same conclusion. What the Egyptians may have seen as divine necessity we see as a disturbing blurring of family roles. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is the silence of the daughters themselves. Their voices are lost to history. We have no letters, no diaries, no personal confessions from Bintanith or Meritamen. Did they see themselves as dutiful daughters, proud to serve their father and king? Or did they carry private sorrow, forced into roles that robbed them of ordinary love and choice? We can never truly know. What we can say is that they lived within a system that demanded absolute obedience to the pharaoh, a system where divine kingship was more powerful than personal freedom. Their silence echoes louder than words, reminding us that history is often told from the perspective of power, not those who lived under its weight. When we look at Ramses II today, standing tall in statues across Egypt, we must remember both sides of his legacy. He was a builder, a warrior, a king who gave Egypt some of its greatest monuments. But he was also a man whose obsession with power led him to blur the boundaries of family and morality. His marriages to his daughters are not just footnotes in history, they are windows into the unsettling truth of how far divine kingship could go in ancient Egypt. It is a story that forces us to confront the complexities of history, where greatness and darkness are often intertwined. Did you know that the very temples Ramses II built to glorify his reign may also hold silent proof of his disturbing family unions? Walk into the great temple of Abu Simbel, one of the most iconic monuments of ancient Egypt, and you'll find not only the colossal statues of Ramses himself, but also the carefully carved images of his family. Among them are the figures of his daughters, elevated to stand beside their father, not just as princesses, but as queens. These carvings were not mistakes or artistic flourishes, they were deliberate political statements, frozen in stone for eternity. To the Egyptians, this display reinforced Ramses' divine authority. To us, it reveals something far more unsettling: the legitimization of marriages between father and daughter in the name of preserving royal power. Abu Simbel is a monument of overwhelming grandeur, with its 4 towering statues of Ramses seated on the throne, each nearly 70 feet tall. But look closer, and you'll notice smaller statues placed beside his legs. These are not just decorative figures, they represent members of his family, including his queen daughters Bintanith, for example, is often shown in such positions, her image etched into the temple's stone walls as a symbol of her importance. Her status as great royal wife was carved into history alongside the might of her father. For Ramses, this was more than family pride, it was propaganda. He wanted future generations to see that his queens came from his own blood, that his rule was supported by a family circle so pure and divine that it did not need outsiders. But this was not limited to Abu Simbel. Other temples, including those at Thebes and Pyramuses, the city Ramses himself built as his capital, display similar imagery. Everywhere you look, Ramses made sure to show his daughters as more than mere children. They were queens in their own right. Egyptologists have noted that this was unusual, even for Egyptian standards. While sibling marriages were somewhat common among the royals, father-daughter unions were less frequently documented. Ramses, however, broke that boundary with boldness, almost as if daring history itself to question him. By displaying these marriages in art and temple inscriptions, he normalized what to modern eyes look shocking and deeply disturbing. One of the reasons Ramses may have taken this step was his obsession with control. His reign was longer than almost any other pharaoh, but with that length came complications. Many of his sons died before him, leaving him with the problem of succession. By the time he was in his 80s and 90s, Ramses had already buried dozens of heirs. To prevent chaos in the royal family, he may have believed that keeping his daughters as queens ensured loyalty and reduced the chance of rivals rising from outside families. In other words, these marriages were not just about religion or divine symbolism, they were about power, politics, and survival. Still, one cannot help but wonder what daily life was like for these royal daughters who became queens. Imagine walking through the halls of the palace, knowing that you were both daughter and wife to the same man. To the public, you were worshipped as a goddess, adorned in jewels and fine linen, standing beside the most powerful man in the world. But in private, the burden must have been heavy. There was no space for personal choice, no opportunity for marriage outside the palace, no hope of ordinary life. Their fate was sealed by birth, and their lives were instruments of their father's ambition. In this way, the glory of Egypt was built upon a quiet, hidden tragedy. The evidence of these marriages also appears in burial practices. Ramses' daughters who became queens were often buried in tombs of extraordinary richness, their status recorded for eternity. Bintanith's tomb in the Valley of the Queens is one such example. The inscriptions honor her as both daughter and great royal wife, leaving no doubt about her dual role. This tomb, like many others, is a haunting reminder of how the Egyptians immortalized what we see as taboo. They celebrated it, painted it on walls, and wrote it into their history, making sure it could not be erased. To them, this was a continuation of the divine cycle. To us, it feels like a dark paradox, the beauty of Egyptian art, hiding stories of family unions we find difficult to accept. But the question remains, did everyone in Egypt embrace this idea, or was there silent resistance? History rarely records the voices of the common people, but it is possible that ordinary Egyptians viewed these marriages with less enthusiasm than the priests and royals who promoted them. To the farmers, workers, and soldiers who built Ramses' temples, the idea of marrying one's daughter may have been shocking even then. Yet, in a society where the pharaoh was worshipped as a god, questioning his choices could mean death. Silence became the shield of survival. Thus, the disturbing truth of Ramses' family remained locked within the palace, hidden behind the golden masks of divine kingship. As Ramses aged, his image as a god became more exaggerated. He ruled for so long that many Egyptians had known no other pharaoh in their lifetime. For them, Ramses was eternal. His decision to marry his daughters may have seemed strange, but it also reinforced the idea that his family was unlike any other, closer to the gods than to mortals. This separation between the royal family and ordinary people was key to maintaining control. It justified not only his power, but also the absolute submission of his subjects. And so, the marriages served a dual purpose. They kept the dynasty secure, while reminding everyone that the pharaoh stood above human morality. Today, historians and archaeologists continue to debate the extent of these unions. Some argue they may have been more symbolic than physical, a way of granting daughters political power without truly treating them as wives in the full sense. Others, however, point to evidence that suggests these marriages were real and consummated. Either way, the impact on history is undeniable. Ramses II is remembered as one of the greatest rulers of all time, but the shadow of his disturbing family choices lingers over his legacy. His story forces us to ask difficult questions about power, morality, and the lengths rulers will go to preserve their authority. Did you know that Ramses II's family was so vast that it almost became a kingdom within a kingdom? Historians estimate that he had over 100 children, born to different wives and concubines, making his household one of the largest in recorded history. Managing such a massive family was not only a personal challenge, but also a political one. Every child represented a potential heir, a possible rival, or a pawn in the great chess game of dynastic power. It is within this enormous, tangled web of relationships that Ramses' marriages to his daughters make grim sense. In his mind, perhaps only by bringing some of them closer, much closer could he ensured that his throne remained unshakable. Imagine the royal court at Ramses' magnificent capital city. It was filled with palaces, gardens, temples, and administrative buildings, but at its heart, the real power resided in the royal family. The court must have been alive with constant intrigue, brothers competing for influence, mothers fighting for their sons' chances at the throne, daughters carefully groomed for positions of priestesses or queens. In this environment, Ramses could not afford disloyalty. By taking daughters such as Bintanith and Meritamen as great royal wives, he removed them from the political battlefield. They would no longer be married to rival princes or ambitious nobles. Instead, they would remain within his inner circle, serving both as daughters and as queens, bound to him in loyalty and power. But this decision also reflected something deeper: Ramses' obsession with divine kingship. The Egyptians believed their king was a living god, the son of Ra, destined to rule with eternal authority. For such a figure, ordinary rules of morality did not apply. If the gods themselves, like Isis and Osiris, could marry siblings, then why not the pharaoh? This justification was central to Ramses' choice. By marrying his daughters, he was imitating the gods, reinforcing the divine aura of his throne. His actions blurred the line between human family and cosmic order, elevating his dynasty above normal human relationships. What we see as disturbing, he may have seen as necessary to fulfill his role as God-king. Yet the disturbing reality of these marriages lies not only in the symbolism, but also in the lived experiences of his daughters. Think of Bintaneth, raised as a princess with wealth, luxury, and privilege. From a young age, she must have known her destiny was unlike that of ordinary women. But could she have imagined that her path would lead her to be her father's wife? Her name appears proudly inscribed on temples and monuments, but behind the carvings lies a silence. We do not hear her voice, her thoughts, or her feelings. Did she accept her fate with devotion, believing it to be divine will? Or did she carry hidden sorrow, trapped in a life she could not escape? History does not tell us, but the weight of her role must have been immense. Another daughter, Meritamen, followed a similar path. She, too, was elevated to great royal wife, and her image stands alongside Ramses in temples. She was honored as a queen, worshipped as a goddess, and remembered in tomb inscriptions. But again, the titles masked the personal cost. These women were celebrated for their divine roles, yet their humanity was overshadowed by the demands of kingship. To modernize, their marriages feel less like honors and more like chains of gold and power. Perhaps, but chains nonetheless. The longer Ramses lived, the more complicated this web became. His reign lasted over 66 years, and in that time he outlived many wives, sons, and even grandchildren. As he grew older, his daughters became not just companions, but pillars of stability in his court. They were his queens, standing beside him in rituals and ceremonies, reinforcing the idea that his reign was eternal and unbroken. Their presence was meant to project strength, but it also revealed the darker truth, that Ramses' obsession with control extended even into the most intimate corners of his family life. Archaeologists have uncovered inscriptions that give us glimpses into this reality. In tombs and temples, Ramses' daughters are shown wearing crowns, holding scepters, and performing the roles of queens. They are presented as dignified, powerful, and sacred. But to the trained eye, the inscriptions also confirm their dual identity, both daughters and wives. This duality is what makes Ramses' story so disturbing. It is not just the fact that these marriages took place, but the fact that they were celebrated, immortalized, and legitimized by the very culture that worshipped him. For Egyptologists, this raises an important question. How did the Egyptian people feel about these unions? Did they truly see them as divine, or did they quietly question the morality behind them? The truth may never be known. Ancient Egypt was a society built on hierarchy and obedience. To challenge the pharaoh was to challenge the gods themselves. Most Egyptians probably accepted what they were told, that their king was acting in divine order. But somewhere in the shadows, perhaps, whispers of discomfort spread. Perhaps some people, even priests or scribes, wondered if the line between divinity and corruption had been crossed. Still, Ramses' legacy remains larger than this one disturbing truth. He is remembered as the great ancestor, the king who left more monuments than any other, the ruler whose name echoed across Egypt for centuries. His military campaigns, his colossal statues, his temples carved into cliffs, all of these achievements overshadow the darker aspects of his reign. Yet, when we peel back the layers of glory, we cannot ignore the unsettling reality of his family life. The image of Ramses as a god-king is forever stained by the knowledge that he blurred the most sacred boundaries of family. And so, the story of Ramses II forces us to confront the dual nature of history. Greatness and darkness often walk hand in hand. The same man who built Abu Simbel also married his daughters. The same king who expanded Egypt's power also confined his own children in roles they did not choose. History remembers Ramses as one of the greatest pharaohs, but the disturbing truth of his marriages reminds us that even the mightiest rulers carried shadows in their lives. It is a reminder that power, when left unchecked, can twist even the most sacred of human bonds. Did you know that Ramses II's reign lasted so long that he became almost a myth in his own lifetime? Most pharaohs ruled for a decade or two, some for 30 or 40 years if fortunate, but Ramses stretched his rule to nearly 7 decades. By the time he died, many Egyptians had never known another king. He had become the embodiment of Egypt itself, a figure who seemed eternal. But with such longevity came an extraordinary problem. Nearly everyone he loved, trusted, or appointed had died before him. His wives, his sons, his grandsons, all fell to the passage of time. While Ramses continued to live, out of necessity, his daughters became his queens, not only out of loyalty, but also because so few others of suitable rank remained alive to stand beside him. This strange dynamic turned the royal palace into both a sanctuary and a prison. On one hand, Ramses' daughters enjoyed lives of luxury that few in history could even imagine. They were dressed in fine linens, adorned with golden jewelry, painted with kohl, and perfumed with exotic oils. They lived in palaces filled with gardens, pools, musicians, and servants who catered to their every need. To the outside world, they were the most honored women in Egypt, queens who shared the throne with the greatest ruler the country had ever known. But beneath the golden splendor lay the truth. Their freedom was sacrificed at the altar of their father's obsession with power. Bintaneth is perhaps the most famous of Ramses' daughter wives. Her name appears frequently in inscriptions, always beside Ramses, never apart. She was elevated early in her life to Great Royal Wife, a title that placed her at the very top of Egyptian society. Merit-Amen, another daughter, also shared this fate, and possibly others did as well. Their presence in temples and tombs was meant to signal unity, stability, and divine favor. To Ramses, their queenship was a political shield. He could trust his daughters in ways he might never trust foreign princesses or even Egyptian nobles. By keeping power in the family, he removed the danger of rival alliances. But this act of political strategy came at an enormous personal cost to his daughters, who were forced into roles they could never refuse. The religious justification for these unions was drawn straight from Egyptian mythology. The gods themselves often married within their families. Isis married her brother Osiris, and their union produced Horus, the divine heir. For Egyptians, divine incest was not only acceptable, but sacred, a way to preserve purity and godliness. Ramses, embodying Horus on earth, simply extended this logic. By marrying his daughters, he was imitating the gods, reinforcing his image as the divine king. But while the priests and scribes carved these unions into stone with reverence, we cannot ignore the human reality. Myths may justify acts in the heavens, but on earth, they carried consequences, especially for the daughters who lived under their weight. One haunting aspect of this story is the lack of personal testimony. We know Ramses' daughters by name: Bintaneth, Merit-Amen, Nebetowebet. We know nothing of their voices. No writings, no confessions, no preserved stories remain to tell us what they truly thought. Did they see themselves as honored queens fulfilling divine destiny? Or did they suffer silently, trapped in gilded cages? Their silence is perhaps the loudest echo in this story, reminding us that history is often told by the powerful, while the powerless are left voiceless. It is also worth noting that Ramses was not the first pharaoh to cross these boundaries. Akhenaten, the heretic king, is believed to have married his daughter, and even earlier dynasties practiced sibling marriages to keep the bloodline pure. But Ramses pushed this further than most, elevating not one but multiple daughters to queenly status. In doing so, he left a trail of inscriptions and monuments that make the practice undeniable. He did not hide it, he celebrated it. His confidence in these choices suggests that he did not see them as shameful at all, but as part of the natural order of divine kingship. Still, even if Ramesses believed his actions were justified, the question of succession remained a nightmare. With so many children, and with so many heirs dying before him, the line of inheritance became chaotic. By the end of his reign, his 13th son, Meneptah, finally inherited the throne, but by then Ramses was over 90 years old. His daughters, who had served as his queens, were left behind in history, remembered only through carvings and titles. Their lives, filled with ritual and ceremony, were bound forever to their father's legacy. Archaeological evidence helps us piece together this disturbing puzzle. In the Valley of the Queens, the tomb of Bintaneth bears inscriptions that honor her as both king's daughter and great royal wife. This duality is etched into stone, leaving no room for doubt. Merit-Amen's name appears in similar contexts, further confirming the pattern. These tombs are not hidden scandals, but celebrated monuments. The Egyptians did not shy away from these truths, they enshrined them as eternal symbols of loyalty, divinity, and power. For modern readers, this creates a deep tension. On one hand, we admire Ramses II as one of the greatest rulers of all time, a man who built some of the most enduring monuments in human history. On the other hand, we recoil from the knowledge of his marriages to his daughters, seeing them as disturbing and morally unacceptable. This tension is what makes Ramses such a fascinating and unsettling figure. His greatness and his darkness cannot be separated, they exist together, shaping the legacy he left behind. Perhaps this is why Ramses' story continues to captivate us today. He was not a simple hero or villain, but a complex man driven by ambition, faith, and obsession. His actions challenge our understanding of history, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that power often comes with shadows. For his daughters, those shadows were inescapable. They lived their lives as queens of Egypt, but also as prisoners of their father's will. Their silence reminds us that history is not just about kings and battles, but also about the hidden sacrifices of those who had no choice. Did you know that Ramses II's obsession with power extended so deeply into his family life that even death could not break the strange bonds he created? In the Valley of the Queens, archaeologists have discovered tombs that speak silently of this dark legacy. Princess queens like Meritamen and Bintaneth were buried with extraordinary honor. Their resting places adorned with rich colors, symbols of eternity, and inscriptions that praised their union with the divine Pharaoh. Yet, when you look closely, the artwork tells a haunting story. In many scenes, these women are not shown as independent figures, but as eternal companions to Ramses himself. Even in the afterlife, they were not released from their role as both daughters and wives. Their existence revolved around the pharaoh in life and in death. Imagine being remembered not for who you were, but only for the role imposed upon you. These tombs, though magnificent, feel less like tributes to individuals and more like extensions of Ramses' overwhelming ego. The psychological dimension of this story is as chilling as the historical one. In ancient Egypt, children of royalty were raised under strict hierarchies, with constant reminders that their father was not just a man but a god. To disobey him was to disobey the divine order. For daughters like Meritamen and Bintaneth, this meant their choices were predetermined. They likely grew up being told that their highest honor was to serve their father in whatever way he deemed necessary. This conditioning blurred the lines between devotion, duty, and exploitation. Modern readers may feel outrage, but within the cultural framework of the time, these girls might have seen no alternative. They were born into cages of gold adorned, praised, and honored, but still trapped. The tragedy lies in the fact that their suffering was invisible, masked by rituals, and justified by myths. Ramses' incestuous marriages also reveal something profound about the nature of absolute power. When a man becomes worshipped as a god, the boundaries of morality can be rewritten at will. What would be condemned in ordinary families became celebrated in the royal household. The people who worshipped Ramses may never have questioned his actions, because to them, he embodied divine authority. And yet, even divinity needs to be constantly reinforced. That is why Ramses covered Egypt with his image. From the colossal statues at Abu Simbel to the endless inscriptions at Karnak and Luxor, these monuments were more than stone, they were tools to silence doubt. They shouted to the world, "The Pharaoh is God, and whatever he does is holy." But the very need to shout suggests there were whispers of discomfort that could never be fully silenced. Foreign observers of Egypt, especially later Greek historians, were often horrified when they learned of these practices. To them, Egypt's royal customs seemed unnatural, even monstrous. They described Egyptian rulers as powerful but corrupted, willing to sacrifice morality for the sake of preserving bloodlines and divine images. This clash of perspectives reveals how unique Egypt's royal ideology was. Within Egypt, incestuous marriages could be wrapped in myth and ritual, but outside Egypt, they were seen as shocking evidence of decadence. Ramses II's legacy, therefore, has always been double-edged, a ruler of immense greatness, but also a symbol of disturbing excess. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: did Ramses II truly believe in the divinity of his actions? Or did he know, deep down, that he was bending morality to serve his throne? Was he a man blinded by religious conviction, or a calculating ruler who used myth as a mask for power? The evidence suggests he was both. Ramses was deeply devoted to the gods and saw himself as their chosen representative, but he was also shrewd enough to use religion as a political weapon. By marrying his daughters, he could maintain absolute control over the throne, the priesthood, and the image of his dynasty. It was a move both religious and strategic, a disturbing blend of faith and manipulation, and that is what makes his story so unforgettable. Ramses II was not simply a great builder or a great warrior. He was a man who redefined even the most intimate aspects of family to serve his insatiable hunger for power. Did you know that one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history, Ramses II, often called Ramses The Great is remembered not only for his glorious temples, colossal statues, and legendary military victories, but also for a dark and disturbing family secret. Behind the shining legacy of this mighty ruler lies a tale that still shocks historians and archaeologists: the claim that Ramses II married one of his own daughters. This revelation may sound like a twisted rumor from the corridors of history, yet the evidence, scattered across inscriptions, royal family records, and ancient traditions, suggests that incest was not only practiced but at times celebrated among Egypt's most elite dynasties. To modern ears, the thought is horrifying. How could a father take his daughter as a wife? But in the sacred world of the pharaohs, the rules of morality were often overshadowed by the hunger for power, divine legitimacy, and the preservation of royal bloodlines. When we look at Ramses II, we see a man who reigned for an astonishing 66 years, becoming one of the longest ruling monarchs in history. His name is carved on monuments from the Nile Delta to Nubia. He was a conqueror, a builder, a diplomat, and a godlike figure in the eyes of his people. Yet, as we peel away the golden mask of history, we discover that his family life was tangled in webs of politics, religion, and taboo relationships that today would spark outrage. Ancient Egypt believed that the pharaoh was not just a king, but a living god, the embodiment of Horus on earth. And what better way, they thought, to keep divine blood pure than to marry within the family? To them, it was a way of imitating the gods themselves, who, according to mythology, often married brothers to sisters, fathers to daughters, and mothers to sons. To us, it is unthinkable, but to Ramses, it was tradition, power, and perhaps even necessity. The whispers about Ramses II and his daughters emerge from the inscriptions that survive on temple walls and funerary texts. He fathered over 100 children, making him one of the most fertile rulers in history. Among his many wives and concubines, his daughters often appear not only as princesses, but as queens, depicted standing beside him with titles usually reserved for wives. Scholars have long debated whether these daughters were elevated simply to symbolic roles, or whether they truly shared their father's bed as royal consorts. The strongest suggestion comes from Princess Binteneth, Ramses II's firstborn daughter, who carried the title of Great Royal Wife, a title that traditionally belonged to the pharaoh's chief spouse. This was not a ceremonial honor given lightly. It was the highest rank a woman could achieve in the royal court. Why would a daughter hold this title unless she had become more than just a child of the king? For ancient Egyptians, the union of a father and daughter might have been shocking to outsiders, but within their worldview, it was almost divine. The pharaoh was seen as a god whose bloodline had to remain untainted by outsiders. By marrying his daughter, Ramses II was not only preserving this sacred blood, but also reinforcing his image as the earthly counterpart of the gods. In their mythology, gods like Osiris married their sisters, Isis and Nephthys. The royal family imitated these unions, believing that such marriages granted them divine approval. But while mythology offered justification, reality tells a darker tale. These marriages trapped daughters in roles they could never escape, reducing them from independent women to pawns in a political and religious chess game. Imagine for a moment the life of Princess Binteneth, born into unimaginable luxury. She grew up in palaces lined with gold, educated in reading hieroglyphs, and surrounded by servants who bowed at her feet. Yet, as the daughter of Ramses the Great, her destiny was not her own. The day she became her father's great royal wife, she stepped into a world where personal choice meant nothing, where her role was to secure her father's divine image and strengthen his rule. To us, this feels like betrayal of the highest order. What father would do this? But to Ramses, it was the natural order of kingship, a necessary step to ensure the stability of his dynasty. This disturbing truth opens a window into a larger question: how much of Egyptian history is hidden behind the glittering monuments we admire today? Tourists who stand in awe before the temples of Abu Simbel or Luxor see the majesty of Ramses II, the warrior king and builder. They rarely stop to think about the dark family dynamics that lay behind those stones. Yet, history refuses to let these secrets rest forever. Archaeological evidence, royal inscriptions, and ancient gossip preserved by scribes reveal a world that was far more complex and far more unsettling than we imagine. And so the story of Ramses II marrying his daughter is not merely a scandal. It is a lens through which we can see the clash between divine ideology and human morality, between power and love, between myth and reality. By the end of his reign, Ramses II was worshipped as a god, his image carved on colossal statues that still tower above us. But his legacy carries a disturbing truth, that even the greatest king of Egypt could not escape the temptations, pressures, and corruptions of absolute power. Did Ramses truly love his daughter, or was she just another sacrifice at the altar of power? Was she honored as a queen, or trapped in a gilded cage of incest and politics? These are questions we may never fully answer, but the fragments of history leave little doubt. Behind the grandeur of Ramses the Great was a man willing to cross the most forbidden line to preserve his dynasty. And that chilling fact changes how we see not only Ramses, but the very civilization that crowned him as their god. Did you know that Ramses II's obsession with controlling his dynasty went so far that even foreign diplomacy was entangled with his family politics? While he married his daughters to himself to keep power within Egypt, he also used other daughters as bargaining chips in political alliances. One of the most famous examples was his marriage to a Hittite princess, the daughter of the great king Hattusili III, after the signing of the first known peace treaty in history. Yet, this move stands in stark contrast to how he treated his Egyptian daughters. Foreign princesses were used to secure peace, but Egyptian princesses were absorbed into his own household, transformed into queens. This dual approach reveals the cold calculation behind Ramses' decisions. His daughters were not cherished as individuals. They were instruments either to strengthen alliances abroad or to fortify his godlike image at home. For those absorbed into his inner circle as wives, there was no escape. Their role was permanent, binding them to their father's throne for life and beyond. Archaeological evidence reinforces this disturbing picture. Reliefs in the Ramesseum and Abu Simbel show princesses in positions normally reserved for queens, standing beside Ramses during ceremonies. They are depicted not as children but as regal women, adorned with crowns, jewelry, and the symbols of Hathor, the goddess of love and motherhood. To the ancient viewer, these images communicated divine legitimacy. But to us, they tell a much darker tale, the deliberate rewriting of family into something unnatural. These daughters were recast, not as innocent children, but as embodiments of divine queenship, robbed of their own identities. The temple walls are silent about their voices, their choices, their feelings. All we see is Ramses' version of the truth, polished and eternal. And yet, sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Historians note that while Ramses exalted certain daughters as wives, many others simply disappear from the record. Did they die young? Were they quietly removed from the spotlight because they resisted or failed to play the roles assigned to them? We may never know, but the gaps in the record hint at stories untold, tragedies buried beneath the sands of Egypt. For every daughter immortalized in stone, there may have been others who suffered in silence, their lives swallowed by the weight of royal expectation. It is important to understand that Ramses' actions were not isolated but part of a larger cultural pattern in Egyptian royalty. Pharaohs before him, such as Akhenaten, also blurred the boundaries of family, elevating daughters to positions of power and sometimes implying marriage-like relationships. But Ramses, through his sheer longevity and his relentless self-promotion, brought these practices into sharper focus. He ruled for 66 years, an entire lifetime for many of his subjects. For generation after generation, Egyptians grew up seeing his daughters beside him as queens, their images carved into temples, their presence sanctified in rituals. What began as a political maneuver hardened into tradition, normalized by repetition and ritual. By the time Ramses died, the idea that a pharaoh could marry his daughter was no longer shocking in Egypt. It was simply part of the divine order. Yet outside Egypt, the legacy looked very different. Later, Greek and Roman writers often pointed to these practices as evidence of Egypt's moral corruption. To them, the pharaohs were not divine rulers but tyrants, who had crossed human boundaries in their pursuit of power. This clash of perspectives shows how history is shaped by culture. What one society can sanctify as holy, another can condemn as monstrous. Ramses II's story, therefore, is not just about one man, but about the fragile line between divinity and depravity, power and corruption, myth and reality. His greatness cannot be separated from his darkness. The temples he built still stand glittering under the desert sun, but the shadows they cast tell of families twisted into symbols, of daughters forced into queenship, and of a king who believed himself above the laws of nature itself. Did you know that Ramses II's obsession with preserving his image was so powerful that even his daughters, who who became his wives, were immortalized as eternal queens beside him in temples across Egypt. At Abu Simbel, one of the greatest architectural wonders of the ancient world, statues of his daughters turned queens stand proudly, their faces carved with serenity, their bodies adorned with royal regalia. To a casual visitor, these statues might look like simple symbols of devotion, but to historians, they reveal a far more unsettling truth. These women were not only daughters of the pharaoh, they were his consorts, forced into roles that blurred the natural order of family and power. Their presence in these colossal temples was meant to project legitimacy, to show the people that Ramses' reign was not only blessed by the gods, but mirrored the gods themselves. Just as deities like Osiris and Isis were bound in sacred union, so too was the pharaoh bound to his daughters, a reflection of divine harmony, or so the propaganda claimed. But behind this carefully constructed facade lay human beings with emotions, fears, and desires. Imagine Bintaneth, raised from childhood to worship her father as both king and god, suddenly thrust into the role of his queen. How could she have reconciled the innocence of daughterhood with the burdens of queenship? Did she ever cry in silence, torn between the roles forced upon her? Did she ever question whether the gods truly demanded such sacrifice, or did she bury her doubts beneath layers of ritual and ceremony? These questions may never be answered, but they linger every time we look at her statues or read her name in hieroglyphs. The Egyptians carved only the public truth, not the private pain. Yet the very need to elevate these daughters so prominently suggests they played crucial roles in maintaining Ramses' image, even if it meant erasing their own identities. Ramses II fathered over 100 children, and his palace must have been a place of constant political maneuvering. Within this vast family, certain daughters were elevated above others, chosen for queenship, while the rest faded into obscurity. This selective elevation was not based on love or preference, but on strategy. Daughters who could strengthen Ramses' image were exalted, others were sidelined. It was a chilling reminder that in the royal court, family bonds were never purely human, they were political tools, crafted to serve the throne. For the chosen daughters, being crowned queen was both an honor and a curse. They received jewels, palaces, and divine titles, but they also surrendered their freedom, their personal identity swallowed by the grand narrative of their father's reign. The impact of these choices stretched far beyond the palace walls. The people of Egypt, who adored Ramses as a near god, would have seen these unions as proof of his divine connection, but not everyone was convinced. Some inscriptions hint at tensions within the priesthood, where certain officials struggled to reconcile their faith with the pharaoh's disturbing practices. The priests depended on Ramses for wealth and power, but they also served the gods, and the gods' laws did not always align with the pharaoh's desires. This conflict was never openly expressed after all. Ramses was too powerful, but the undercurrents of unease remind us that even in ancient Egypt, not everyone accepted the pharaoh's actions without question. Silence, enforced by fear, replaced open criticism, and yet Ramses' strategy worked. By the time he died, he had cemented himself as one of the greatest rulers of all time. His name was etched into every corner of Egypt, his statues towered over temples, and his dynasty appeared unshakable. The cost of this glory, however, was borne by those closest to him, his daughters, who were transformed into symbols of power rather than allowed to live as women. Their tombs, though filled with treasures, feel more like prisons of memory than places of rest. They remind us that history's greatest achievements often hide its darkest truths. Ramses' reign glittered with gold and stone, but behind the monuments lay stories of sacrifice, silence, and the disturbing collapse of family boundaries in the name of power. Did you know that even after thousands of years, the figure of Ramses II continues to cast a long shadow over how we perceive kingship, morality, and power? He has been remembered as a ruler who constructed towering monuments, fought legendary battles, and expanded the prestige of Egypt to unprecedented levels. Yet, hidden within this golden image lies the darker tale of how he sought to control not only his kingdom, but also the very bloodline of his family. His decision to marry his daughters is more than a personal scandal, it is a window into the psyche of rulers who believed themselves gods among mortals. For Ramses, the divine mandate was clear. If Pharaoh was the embodiment of the gods, then no mortal outside his bloodline could be worthy of sharing his throne. This chilling reasoning blurred the lines between devotion to tradition and an obsession with power. What is fascinating and disturbing is how this practice became normalized within the palace walls. Courtiers, priests, and even foreign envoys were expected to nod in silence, knowing that the authority of Pharaoh was absolute. To question his marriage to his daughters would be to question the gods themselves. This silence gave Ramesses a cloak of legitimacy, but it also reveals the crushing weight of monarchy where no dissent was tolerated. It forces us to ask, how many voices were silenced? How many individuals sacrificed their moral judgment just to maintain the illusion of divine perfection? The answer may never be known, but what remains is the haunting legacy of a man who placed his dynasty above human decency. His colossal statues, carved deep into stone, still stand as if to proclaim his immortality. Yet behind their unyielding gaze lies a truth carved not in stone, but in silence, scandal, and secrecy. Perhaps this is the greatest paradox of Ramses II, a king both admired for his greatness and whispered about for his darkness. The monuments he left behind sought to immortalize his power, but the shadows of his choices linger, reminding us that history's brightest figures often carry the darkest secrets. And in this haunting duality lies the eternal fascination with Ramses the Great. Did you know that the story of Ramses II does not end with the fall of his dynasty, nor with the crumbling of temples and statues swallowed by the sands of time? His life, glorious and scandalous, has echoed across millennia, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth about power, that greatness and corruption often walk hand in hand. Ramses built monuments so vast they seemed to defy eternity, yet behind their majesty lay choices that would disturb even the most loyal subjects. By marrying his own daughters, he blurred the line between piety and perversion, between the will of the gods and the hunger of a man who refused to surrender control. And though his people praised him as a living deity, the whispers never ceased, carried on through generations. Was Pharaoh truly divine, or just another man hiding behind stone and ritual? Today, when we look upon his colossal statues and the mummified remains of the man himself, we are left not only in awe of his achievements, but also unsettled by his darkness. Ramses II reminds us that history is never pure. It is messy, complex, filled with contradictions. He was a warrior and a builder, a god-king and a mortal with flaws that could not be buried, even under the weight of his monuments. And so, the disturbing truth lingers like a shadow across the ages. Greatness can inspire, but it can also corrupt. Ramses wanted immortality, and in a way, he achieved it. Not because of his monuments alone, but because his story continues to make us question the very nature of power, morality, and legacy. In the end, the man who married his own daughters remains one of history, its most haunting enigma, a reminder that even the mightiest of kings are never free from the judgment of time.